building stood tall and polished, with glass doors that reflected the busy street outside. People walked in and out with confidence, dressed in neat clothes, carrying folders, instruments, and big dreams. Inside, everything looked perfect: bright lights, clean floors, and a quiet kind of pressure that made every step feel important. Near the entrance, a young man paused for a moment before stepping in. He wasn't dressed like the others. His shirt was simple, slightly faded, and his shoes had seen better days. He held nothing fancy in his hands, no expensive case, no thick file of achievements. Just a small, worn notebook and a quiet look in his eyes. He took a slow breath and walked inside. As he entered the waiting area, a few people glanced at him. Some looked for a second longer than needed. Others quickly looked away but whispered to each other. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The feeling in the room said enough. This place was for the best. Everyone here believed they had something special. And to them, he didn't seem to fit. He didn't react. He simply walked to an empty chair in the corner and sat down. His hands rested on his lap, holding the notebook tightly. His eyes moved around the room, quietly observing everything. Across the room, a group of performers stood together, talking and laughing. Their voices were filled with confidence. One of them noticed the young man sitting alone and nudged another. "Look at him," one whispered with a small smirk. "Is he even here for the audition?" A few soft laughs followed. "Maybe he's lost," another added. They didn't try to hide it. They didn't think they needed to. The young man heard them. It was impossible not to. But his expression didn't change. If anything, he lowered his gaze slightly, as if he had heard this kind of thing before. As if it wasn't new. Time passed slowly. One by one, names were called. Each performer walked through the large doors that led to the audition hall. Some came out smiling, others trying to hide disappointment. The room kept shifting with emotions. Hope, fear, excitement, and doubt. The young man stayed quiet. He opened his notebook for a moment. Inside were small handwritten lines, not neat but careful. It wasn't clear what they meant to anyone else, but to him they mattered. His fingers lightly touched the pages, as if reminding himself of something important. Then he closed it again. A staff member walked in, holding a clipboard. The room immediately became quieter. Everyone paid attention. Next, the staff member called out a name. Another performer stood up quickly, fixed their clothes, and walked in with confidence. The young man watched them go. His eyes followed the door until it closed again. He shifted slightly in his seat. His fingers tapped softly against his knee. Not in nervousness, but in rhythm. A quiet rhythm, almost like he could hear something no one else could. More time passed. More names were called. The group across the room continued their comments now and then, though quieter. The young man had become a small source of entertainment for them. "Do you think he even knows what's inside that room?" one said softly. "Doesn't matter," another replied. "He won't last a minute." They chuckled again. Still, he said nothing. At one point, a woman sitting nearby glanced at him with a different expression. Not mocking, not curious, just thoughtful. She noticed how calm he was, how he didn't seem angry or embarrassed, just patient. It was unusual. Finally, after what felt like hours, the staff member returned again. The room fell silent once more. The young man looked up. There was a brief pause as the staff member checked the clipboard. Then his name was called. For a second, nothing happened. The young man didn't move right away, as if he wanted to be sure he heard correctly. The staff member looked up again. "You're up." A few people turned to look at him, some already smiling in anticipation. He stood up slowly. There was no rush in his movement, no sudden burst of energy, just a steady rise, like he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. As he began to walk toward the door, a quiet laugh came from the same group. "This should be interesting," someone whispered. He heard it. Of course he did. But again, no reaction. Each step he took was calm, measured. The closer he got to the door, the quieter the room seemed to become. Not because people stopped thinking, but because something about his presence didn't match their expectations anymore. He reached the door and paused for a brief moment. His hand rested on the handle. For a second he closed his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It felt more like remembering something or someone. Then he opened his eyes and stepped inside. The audition hall was much larger than the waiting area. The lights were brighter, focused on the center of the room where a grand piano stood. It looked polished and perfect, almost like it had its own presence. At the far end, a long table was set. Behind it sat a few judges, including the director. The director didn't look impressed. In fact, he barely looked up at all when the young man entered. "Name?" the director asked, flipping through some papers. The young man quietly said it. The director nodded slightly, though it didn't seem like he was truly paying attention. "All right," he said almost casually. "Be quick." There was no warmth in his voice, no encouragement, just routine. The young man nodded. He turned and began walking toward the piano. His footsteps echoed slightly in the large room. With every step, the distance between him and the outside world grew. The whispers, the laughter, the judgment. It all stayed behind that door. Now it was just him and the piano. He reached the bench and stood there for a moment. The piano looked perfect, clean, untouched, waiting. He slowly sat down. For the first time, there was a small sign of nervousness. His hands rested on his lap, and his fingers tightened slightly. He took a slow breath. The director glanced up briefly, clearly expecting nothing special. One of the other judges leaned back in their chair, looking slightly bored. The room felt still. The young man lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. He didn't start playing yet. Instead, he paused. His fingers rested there, as if they were listening or remembering. In that quiet moment, something changed. Not in the room, not in the judges, but inside him. All the noise from before faded completely. The laughter, the whispers, the looks, none of it mattered here. There was only one thing that mattered now. He took another breath. And just as his fingers began to press down on the first key, the room waited, unaware of what was about to happen. The first note had not yet been played, but the silence in the room already felt heavy. The young man's fingers rested lightly on the keys, as if they were testing the moment rather than rushing into it. Across the room, the director leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting something ordinary, maybe even forgettable. "Any time," the director said, his voice calm but slightly impatient. The young man gave a small nod, though he didn't look back. His eyes stayed on the piano, focused and steady. For a brief second, his fingers moved away from the keys, then returned again, as if he needed one more moment to settle himself. From behind the doors, faint sounds of the waiting area slipped through. Muffled voices, soft laughter. It was distant but still there, a reminder of what had followed him into this room. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then he pressed the first key. The sound was soft, so soft that one of the judges almost didn't react. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't try to grab attention. It simply existed, clear and steady. The director glanced down at his papers again, already half distracted. The young man played the second note, then another. At first it seemed simple, almost too simple, the kind of beginning that made people think they had already understood everything. One of the judges shifted in their seat, resting their chin on their hand. "Basic," someone murmured quietly, but the young man didn't stop. His fingers continued moving, slowly building a pattern. The notes connected, one after another, like small steps forming a path. There was no rush, no attempt to impress too quickly, just patience. Outside, in the waiting area, the group that had laughed earlier stood closer to the door now. Someone had quietly opened it just enough to hear. "Is he playing yet?" one whispered. "Yeah," another replied. "Sounds slow." A quiet chuckle followed. Inside the room, the music continued. The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly as he played. The tension that had been there when he first sat down began to fade. His hands moved more freely now, more naturally. The notes began to change. What started as something simple slowly grew into something deeper. The rhythm shifted, becoming more fluid, more expressive. It wasn't just a sequence anymore. It felt like a voice trying to say something without words. The judge, who had looked bored earlier, straightened up a little. The director's pen paused over the paper. He didn't look up yet, but he stopped writing. The young man's fingers moved with more confidence now. Each note carried a certain weight, like it meant something personal. There was no showiness, no unnecessary speed. Just control and feeling. Outside, the laughter had stopped. "Wait! Listen," someone whispered. Inside, the melody grew stronger. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room in a way that was hard to ignore. The sound reached the corners, wrapped around the silence, and held it there. The director finally looked up. First, it was just a quick glance, but then his eyes stayed. There was a small change in his expression. Not surprise, not yet. Just attention. The young man didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but it didn't matter to him. His focus stayed on the keys. His fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. Every movement felt controlled, intentional. The music began to rise, like something building from deep within. One of the judges leaned forward. "Is this his own piece?" they asked quietly. No one answered. The director's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in concentration. This was no longer something he could ignore. The young man's breathing had changed. It matched the rhythm now, steady, connected. His entire posture had shifted. The nervousness from before was gone. In its place was something else. Something calm. Something certain. Outside the door, more people had gathered. The small gap allowed the music to spill into the hallway. "That's him?" someone asked, surprised. "Doesn't sound like a beginner," another replied softly. Inside, the melody took a deeper turn. There was a sudden change in tone, subtle but clear. The notes carried a different emotion now. Something heavier. Something that felt almost like a memory. The director sat up straighter. His full attention was on the young man now. The room felt different. No one was thinking about appearances anymore. No one was remembering the simple clothes or the quiet entrance. All that mattered was the sound. The young man's fingers moved across the keys with a quiet intensity. There was no hesitation left. No doubt. It was as if the piano was no longer just an instrument. It had become a way for him to speak. One of the judges let out a slow breath, not realizing they had been holding it. The director's expression softened slightly, not into a smile, but into something more thoughtful. The kind of look someone has when they realize they might have been wrong about something. Outside, no one was laughing anymore. They stood in silence, listening. The same people who had made jokes earlier now exchanged quick glances, unsure of what to say. "Did we misjudge him?" one of them whispered. No one answered. Inside, the music continued to grow. It wasn't just beautiful, it felt real. There was a certain honesty in it, something that couldn't be faked or practiced just for show. The young man's hands moved with purpose, but also with feeling. There were moments where the notes slowed, almost like they were taking a breath, and then moments where they rose again, stronger than before. The director leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was listening, carefully. The young man's eyes remained focused on the keys, but there was something distant in them, as if part of him wasn't in the room at all, as if he was somewhere else, somewhere only the music could reach. The melody softened for a moment, becoming almost fragile, the kind of sound that makes a room feel smaller, quieter. One of the judges swallowed slowly. The air felt heavier now, not with pressure, but with emotion. The young man's fingers slowed, then paused for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't a mistake. Felt intentional, like a moment to breathe. Then the music returned, stronger, deeper. The director's eyes didn't move. Whatever expectations he had before were gone. Completely. Outside, someone quietly closed the door a little more, trying to hear better. No one wanted to miss a single note now. Inside, the young man continued to play, unaware of how much the room had changed. Or maybe he was aware, but it didn't matter. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for something else. Something that couldn't be seen. The music carried that feeling forward, filling the silence with something honest and raw. And as the melody continued to unfold, one thing became clear to everyone listening. This was no ordinary performance. The music didn't stop, but something inside the room had already changed. It was no longer just an audition. It didn't feel like a test or a performance meant to impress judges. The sound coming from the piano had turned into something deeper, something that quietly pulled everyone in without asking for attention. The young man's fingers moved with calm control, but there was more weight in every note now. It felt like each sound carried a piece of something real, something lived, not learned from books or lessons alone. The director didn't move at all. His eyes stayed fixed on the young man's hands, following every motion, every shift in rhythm. He had stopped thinking about time. The clipboard in front of him lay untouched. One of the judges slowly leaned back, but not out of boredom anymore. It was more like they were trying to take everything in, not miss anything. The music rose slightly, not in volume, but in feeling. It had a quiet strength, like a voice that had been silent for a long time and had finally found a way to speak. The young man's face remained focused, but his expression had softened. The nervous tension from earlier was completely gone now. In its place was something steady, something almost peaceful. But deep within that calm, there was emotion. It showed in the way his fingers pressed certain keys just a little longer, the way some notes lingered, as if they didn't want to leave. Outside the room, the hallway had grown more crowded. People who had finished their auditions had stayed instead of leaving. They stood quietly now, listening through the slightly open door. No one was whispering anymore. No one was laughing. A few of them exchanged looks, not of amusement, but of quiet disbelief. Inside, the music began to shift again. This time, it carried a softer tone, almost like a memory unfolding slowly. The rhythm became gentler, more delicate. It felt like looking back at something far away, something important. The young man's eyes lowered slightly, and for a brief moment, they seemed distant, as if he wasn't fully in the room anymore, as if he was somewhere else. His fingers slowed, touching the keys with care, almost like he was afraid to break something fragile. One of the judges quietly exhaled, their chest rising and falling slowly. The director's expression changed again, just slightly. There was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Recognition, not of the young man himself, but of the feeling behind the music. It was something he understood, something he hadn't expected to find here. The young man continued, his movements smooth, natural. There was no sign of effort, no struggle to keep up. Everything flowed as if it had always been there, waiting for this moment. The melody dipped lower, becoming softer, almost like a whisper. Felt personal, too personal to fake, too honest to ignore. And then, slowly, it began to grow again. Not suddenly, not sharply, but gradually, like something rising from deep inside. The young man's hands moved faster now, but not in a way that felt rushed. Every note still had meaning. Every transition felt intentional. It was no longer just a memory. It felt like a story unfolding in real time. A story without words, but one that everyone in the room could somehow understand. The director leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting together on the table. He wasn't judging anymore. He was listening, carefully, deeply. The young man's posture remained steady, but there was more energy in his movements now. His shoulders lifted slightly with the rhythm, and his breathing matched the flow of the music. It was as if he had become part of it. Or maybe the music had become part of him. Outside, someone quietly placed a hand over their mouth. Another person blinked a few times, trying to stay focused, as if they were afraid of missing even a second. Inside, the sound filled every corner of the room. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It reached people in a different way. The melody climbed higher, carrying more intensity now. There was a quiet urgency in it, like something trying to break through, something that had been held back for too long. The young man's fingers moved with more force, but still with control. There was no chaos, no loss of balance. Just emotion. Raw, clear emotion. The director's jaw tightened slightly, not out of discomfort, but because something about the music had reached him, something personal. One of the judges glanced at him briefly, noticing the change. But no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. The young man's expression remained calm, but there was a slight tension in his brow now. Not fear, just feeling. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That much was clear. He wasn't playing for approval. He was playing because he had something to say. And the piano was the only way he knew how to say it. The music reached a point where it felt full, complete, as if everything had come together. And then, it softened again. Gently, carefully, like a wave pulling back after reaching the shore. The sudden change caught everyone's attention even more. It wasn't the kind of performance people expected in an audition. There were no flashy moments meant to show off skill. No dramatic pauses meant to create applause. Everything felt real, natural. The young man's fingers slowed once more, each note placed with care. Felt like the ending of something, or maybe the beginning of something new. The director's eyes didn't leave him, not even for a second. The room was completely silent except for the piano. Even the air felt still. The young man took a slightly deeper breath as he played the next few notes. There was something different in them, a sense of closure, but also hope. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't really listening. But it was there, and somehow everyone felt it. Outside, the people in the hallway stood completely still. No one checked their phones. No one spoke. They were all waiting. Inside, the young man continued, his fingers moving slower now, guiding the music toward its final moments. Each note felt like a step closer to the end. But no one wanted it to end. Not yet. The director leaned back slightly, but his gaze remained fixed. His earlier doubt was gone. Completely gone. In its place was something else. Respect. The young man pressed another key, then another. The melody became softer, lighter, almost like a quiet goodbye. His hands hovered for a brief moment between notes, as if choosing each one carefully. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. And as the music gently carried itself forward, one thing became clear to everyone in that room and outside it. This performance was not just being heard. It was being felt, deeply, and no one who was listening would forget it. The music continued, but now it carried something even deeper than before. It wasn't just emotion anymore. It felt like truth. The young man's fingers moved slowly across the keys, each note soft but full. The sound no longer tried to grow or impress. Instead, it settled into something honest, something that felt like it had always been there, waiting to be heard. His eyes stayed lowered, focused, but there was a distant look in them again, and this time it was clearer. He wasn't just playing in the room. He was remembering. The melody shifted into something more fragile, almost like a quiet voice from the past. The notes came gently, with small pauses between them, like careful steps through old memories. In his mind, he was no longer sitting at a grand piano. He was somewhere else, a much smaller place. A dim room with cracked walls and a single window that barely let in light. The air felt still there, heavy with silence. In the corner of that room stood an old piano, its surface worn, its keys slightly uneven. Some of them didn't even sound right. But to him, it had been everything. His fingers had first learned to move on those broken keys. Slowly, patiently, without guidance, without anyone to show him the right way. Just listening, just trying. Back in the present, his hands moved with care, as if they still remembered that old instrument, as if they respected where it all began. The director watched closely, his expression no longer guarded. He could feel it now. This wasn't just skill. This was a story. The young man pressed a slightly lower note, holding it just long enough for it to echo softly through the room. It carried a quiet sadness, but not the kind that feels heavy. More like something accepted, something understood. In his memory, the room shifted again. There were nights when the power would go out, leaving everything in darkness. No light, no sound except the faint noise from outside. But even then, he would sit at that old piano. His fingers would move across the keys, guided only by memory and feeling. He couldn't always hear the notes clearly, but he didn't stop, because it wasn't about perfect sound. It was about holding on to something. Back in the audition hall, the melody deepened. The young man's shoulders lifted slightly as he played, his breathing steady, connected to every movement. His hands didn't hesitate. They knew exactly where to go. One of the judges lowered their gaze for a moment, quietly absorbing the sound. There was something about it that felt personal, even to those who didn't know his story. Because they didn't need to. They could feel it. Outside the door, someone leaned against the wall, eyes closed, listening carefully. Inside, the young man's fingers moved into a softer section. The notes became lighter, almost hopeful. And again his mind drifted. He saw a younger version of himself sitting alone, repeating the same simple pattern over and over again. Sometimes it didn't sound right. Sometimes his fingers slipped. But he kept going. There had been no applause, no audience, no one to tell him he was doing well, but also no one to tell him to stop. That had been enough. The melody in the present began to rise slightly, carrying that quiet determination with it. The director leaned forward again, his hands now resting on the table, his eyes focused, unblinking. He wasn't analyzing anymore. He was listening like everyone else. The young man's expression changed just a little, not into a smile, but into something softer, something that reflected what he was feeling inside. The music flowed more freely now. There was no trace of nervousness left, no doubt, just connection. The notes began to come together in a way that felt complete, like pieces of a story slowly finding their place. In his memory, the room grew quieter. Time had passed there, though it never felt clear how much. Days and nights blended together. But the piano had always been there, always waiting, even when everything else felt uncertain. Back in the present, the melody carried that same feeling, a sense of holding on, of continuing, no matter how quiet or unseen the journey had been. One of the judges wiped their hands together slowly, not out of discomfort, but to steady themselves. The room had become deeply still, filled only with the sound of the piano. Outside, no one moved, no one spoke. They all listened. The young man's fingers pressed into a slightly stronger note, and the sound spread gently through the space. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, meaning, felt like a turning point, as if everything he had been holding inside was finally being shared. Not explained, not shown off, just shared. The director's expression softened again, more clearly this time. There was no doubt left in his eyes, only respect. The young man's hands moved with quiet strength, guiding the music forward. Each note felt certain, placed exactly where it needed to be. There was no extra movement, no unnecessary show, just truth. The melody began to slow again, carefully, naturally, like a story reaching its final chapter. But it didn't feel like an ending filled with loss. It felt like understanding, like something that had been carried for a long time had finally been set down. The young man's breathing remained steady, his posture calm. His fingers moved gently now, almost like they were saying goodbye to something important. In his memory, the small room faded. The old piano, the quiet nights, the long hours of practice. All of it slowly disappeared into the distance. But not in a sad way, in a peaceful way, because those moments had led him here, back in the audition hall, back to this piano, back to this moment. The music softened further, each note lighter than the last. The room felt almost weightless. No one shifted in their seat. No one looked away. They were all there, fully present. The young man pressed another key, letting the sound linger. Then another, slower, gentler. The melody was nearing its end, but it didn't feel rushed. Felt right. The director sat still, his earlier impatience now impossible to imagine. He wasn't thinking about schedules or auditions anymore. Only this, only the music, only the young man sitting at the piano. And as the final part of the melody approached, one thing was clear to everyone in that room. This was more than a performance. It was a life quietly told through sound, and no one would ever hear it the same way again. The final notes came slowly, like soft footsteps fading into the distance. Each one was placed with care, as if the young man didn't want the moment to end too quickly. His fingers moved gently, almost reluctantly, across the keys. Then, with one last quiet touch, the music stopped. The sound didn't disappear right away. It lingered in the air, settling into the silence that followed. No one moved. No one spoke. The room stayed completely still. The young man's hands remained on the keys for a moment longer. His head lowered slightly, his breathing calm, steady. It didn't feel like he was waiting for a reaction. It felt like he was simply finishing something that mattered to him. Slowly, he lifted his hands. They hovered above the piano for a second before dropping gently back to his lap. Silence. It stretched longer than anyone expected. One of the judges shifted slightly in their chair but didn't speak. Another looked down for a moment, then back up again, as if trying to process what they had just heard. The director didn't move at all. His eyes stayed on the young man, not with doubt anymore, not with distance, but with quiet focus. Outside the door, the hallway was just as silent. The people standing there waited, almost frozen in place, as if any movement might break something important. Inside, the young man finally stood up. His movements were simple, calm, just like when he had walked in. There was no dramatic gesture, no sign that he expected applause or praise. He stepped away from the piano and turned toward the judges. For a brief moment he looked at them, not with hope, not with fear, just with quiet honesty. Then he lowered his gaze slightly. Still no one spoke. The silence grew heavier, but not uncomfortable. Felt meaningful. Finally, the director took a slow breath. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. His expression had changed completely from the beginning. The earlier impatience, the quick judgment, it was all gone. In its place was something steady, something real. He stood up. The sound of his chair moving echoed softly in the quiet room. It was the first clear noise since the music had ended. One of the judges looked at him, slightly surprised. He hadn't stood up for anyone else that day. Not once. The young man noticed, but his expression didn't change much. He simply watched, calm and still. The director took a step forward. For a moment it seemed like he might speak immediately. But he didn't. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. Then, instead of speaking right away, he gave a small nod. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it carried weight. Respect. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they felt different coming from him. There was no trace of dismissal in his voice now. No distance. Just sincerity. The young man nodded back slightly. He didn't smile widely. He didn't show excitement. But there was something softer in his expression now. Something lighter. The director looked at him for another moment, then glanced briefly at the other judges. None of them had anything to add. They didn't need to. What had just happened spoke for itself. Outside, someone slowly pushed the door open a little wider. The people in the hallway leaned in, trying to see. The same group who had laughed earlier stood near the front. Their faces looked different now. No smirks. No whispers. Just quiet. One of them looked down at the floor. Another crossed their arms, not out of confidence, but uncertainty. Inside, the young man took a small step back from the center of the room. It looked like he was about to leave. "Wait," the director said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly. The young man stopped. He turned slightly, looking back. The director walked around the table, closing the distance between them. Each step was steady, unhurried. When he stood in front of the young man, he paused again. Up close, the difference between them was even clearer. One dressed in polished confidence, the other in simple quiet. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a difference that mattered. "What you just played," the director said slowly, "that wasn't something you learn overnight." The young man didn't respond right away. He simply listened. The director continued, his voice thoughtful. There was something real in it. He stopped again, as if trying to find the right way to say what he meant. Then he gave a small, almost surprised breath. "You didn't just play the piano," he added. "You told something." The young man's eyes lowered slightly again, but this time it wasn't out of discomfort. It was quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice was calm, just like everything else about him. The director studied him for a moment longer. Then he nodded once more. "You can go for now," he said. "We'll be in touch." It wasn't a loud promise. It wasn't dramatic. But it was more than enough. The young man nodded again. He turned and began walking toward the door. As he reached it, he opened it slowly. The hallway came into view. All the people who had been listening stepped back slightly, making space. No one laughed this time. No one whispered. They watched him in silence as he stepped out. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He simply walked forward, calm and steady, just like when he had arrived. But something had changed. Not in the way he walked, not in his appearance, but in the way the world around him responded. The same people who had doubted him now avoided his gaze. Some looked thoughtful. Some looked uncertain. One or two looked quietly ashamed. But the young man didn't stop. He walked past them, holding his small notebook in one hand, just like before. As he reached the end of the hallway, the noise of the outside world slowly returned. Distant voices, footsteps, life moving on. He stepped out of the building, the glass doors closing softly behind him. For a moment he paused. He looked up at the sky. It was the same as before. Nothing had changed out there. But something inside him felt different. Not bigger, not louder, just lighter. He took a slow breath. Then he began to walk away. Back inside the building, the director returned to his seat. But he didn't pick up his pen right away. He looked at the empty space where the young man had been sitting. The piano stood there, silent now. But it didn't feel the same. The room didn't feel the same. One of the judges spoke quietly. "That was unexpected." The director gave a small nod. "Yes," he said. Then after a short pause, he added, "and unforgettable." Outside, the young man continued walking, blending into the everyday world once again. No one on the street knew what had just happened inside. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. And that was fine, because he hadn't played for recognition. He had played because he had something to say. And for the first time, people had truly listened. The laughter was gone. The doubt was gone. All that remained was the quiet truth he had carried with him all along. That real talent doesn't need to prove itself with words. It simply waits for the right moment. And when that moment comes, it speaks for itself.